It looks like it's been passed over to me to host now. So yeah, thank you for that, James. I was really keen to get involved in this project because, as it was mentioned earlier, I'm the women's football correspondent for a website called The Athletic, and previously I was part of the women's sport team at the Daily Telegraph, working with Anna Kessel. And I think when you work in women's sport you don't have to work in it very long to realise that it's really a mirror of what we value in society. It's a real reflection of the things that we get wrong. So I feel that women's sport engages very profoundly with a lot of the issues that James outlined in the video at the beginning. So that was why I was very, very keen to get involved with this. And obviously we've got three fantastic speakers who are going to be doing really, really great work today and raising hopefully some money for their chosen charities as well, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. We've got a video to play later on. So our first speaker, we've got Helen Ward, who I've spoken to Helen lots of times, so she's probably a little bit sick of me. But she's a striker for Watford and has previously played for Chelsea, Reading and Arsenal. Internationally, she is Wales' all-time record goal scorer of either gender. And Helen is quite known in women's football circles for being one of the few mums to play football. When she was at Yeovil, she withdrew from her contract because she was pregnant with her second child, and now in lockdown she's had to balance homeschooling with training and raising her two children. And she's going to be talking about that in a little bit more detail with us. And her chosen charity is the Ollie Foundation, which we'll talk about in more detail later on when we get to the video. Our second speaker is Rachel Morris. She is a Paralympic gold medalist for cycling and rowing, and she won a gold medal at Rio 2016 as a rower. She lost both of her legs due to complex regional pain syndrome and was diagnosed with anorexia and bulimia as a teenager. She didn't really have any support from her coaches, even when she asked for help, and she's a patron of her charity Challenges, which again we'll watch a video on later on. And lastly, we have Ollie Phillips, who is a former professional rugby union player, captain of the England Sevens, and was named World Rugby Player of the Year in 2009. While he was preparing for the Rugby World Cup what year would that have been?
2013.
2013, so a lot more recently than I would imagine, but he injured his calf, which caused his rugby career to end very, very abruptly, but then picked himself back up again, broke a Guinness World Record for hosting the most northerly rugby match in the North Pole, climbed Kilimanjaro, ran the London Marathon, and started studying at Cambridge University, and his chosen charity is Wooden Spoon. So we'll sort of leap between you as we get going. So if we start off with you, Helen, do you want to talk about your experiences in football with your first pregnancy when you were pregnant with Emily?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'd moved to Reading, who at the time were in the WSL2, which is the equivalent of the Championship now, so the second tier, and it'd only just been formed, so there was a bit of a hiatus between the seasons, and I think I joined in around the October or November time, but the season wasn't due to start till April because it used to be a summer league. And so I'd signed under then manager Jane Ludlow, and I think when it got to about January time, I found out that I was pregnant with Emily, my daughter. So having not played a game for the club, or actually I think I did play one just after I found out, but having not, really played too much for the club, I had to let the manager know that in fact I wasn't going to be able to play for the whole season. She wasn't due till September. And although I'd signed a contract and I was under contract there, I decided that it wasn't fair for me to take up a place in the squad, take up some of their budget. So we mutually terminated the contract under the sort of understanding that when I was ready, that they'd give me an opportunity to come back and sort of almost prove myself again and rejoin the team when the time was right. So I was kind of without a club for both my pregnancies in theory, as I stepped away, and with Emily as well being my first, I wasn't really sure what you could and couldn't do training wise, because obviously you worry so much about your baby's health, your own health. You don't want to do too much and put anything in danger. So I probably didn't do as much training as I should have, or as I'd have liked to have done, just because of that worry, and there wasn't really much knowledge around of what the best way to go about it was. You don't really see too many women training while they're pregnant, or you certainly didn't 6 or 7 years ago when I was going through it. So it was sort of the unknown and just trying to get through it, pregnancy as anyone else would, rather than from an athlete's perspective. So it was quite difficult, and it meant that I had a couple of problems post birth that I wasn't aware of. In terms of diastasis recti, which is when your abdominal muscles sort of split a bit too far, and you have to make sure you rehab that. But I wasn't aware that was even a condition until after I'd had her, and I sort of said to the physio with Wales at the time that it felt a bit uncomfortable when I was running. I couldn't put my finger on what it was. It wasn't really a pain. I just didn't feel like my body was together, which makes sense because it literally wasn't together. I had to rehab that, and it just opened my eyes to sort of the lack of knowledge around pregnancy and birth in sport, or certainly in women's football anyway. It may be different in other sports, but there was certainly that sort of lack of knowledge. Even the physios, not many of them had dealt with it before, sports scientists, that kind of thing, let alone the athletes themselves. So it was kind of a bit of the unknown when I went through my first pregnancy with Emily, definitely.
I muted myself to not get any feedback and then forgot to unmute myself, which we've all done over the past sort of year in lockdown. Rachel, can you sort of give us a quick summary of your experiences and your battle with your eating disorders before we get into that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, hi everyone. I have had a slightly stranger career in the sense of jumping around different sports, which perhaps isn't quite as often done. I've gone from sailing to cycling to rowing, and then now in kayaking, Nordic skiing. So I've sort of had different experiences. I've had really positive experiences along the way, just to make sure people do understand that I have had some really good support as well. And I've had some, really challenging times. I was a runner until I was 17 when I first started having problems with my legs. And I'd always had an Olympic dream, being a sprinter at that point. And I had sort of, I guess a couple of coaches had said things to me when I was around 16, 17 at that point, about weight, and I'd taken it on, at that point, probably in a slightly more extreme way as well, and went sort of quite quickly into the anorexic sort of way of living, I guess, at that point. And then having legs amputated and quite a lot of time in hospital and away from family, away from normal life, I found that quite a challenge. And at that point, definitely, quite a long time ago now, but a long time ago, there wasn't the support around in mental health, particularly if there was a physical disability or physical problems with that. So around amputation, there was very little support. And I think that it probably just ingrained a lot of habits and ways of coping that weren't productive, because I wasn't given alternative ways, probably, and that support. And then sport was my way of coping, and that sort of, I knew how to live like that. I knew that's what I could do. And to have that taken away at that point, I think was probably one of the reasons as well that I really struggled. And then coming back into elite sport as a Paralympic athlete, part of that gave me back everything that we know from athletes that we get from sport, but also it is different. It was seen as differently. It is changing. It's changed and gone on in a more positive light since London 2012, but we are still different in that sense. It's not the same. Also struggle in that area, and then I think sort of if you put mental health into that as well, I think it's not always the easiest for them to deal with. I don't think they have the resources or the understanding to do it yet, and so I think it's a combination of a few things for me.
Thank you, Rachel. And Ollie, do you want to give us a quick summary of your career and then how your injury, which, if it sounds from the brief here, was very, very sudden, sort of derailed that a little bit for you and ended it, really? Oh, I think you're on mute. I can't hear you.
We might have to double check Ollie's connection. We'll come back to him in a second. I'll jump on that.
Okay, I'll carry on in his absence then. Rachel, can you describe your life before the bulimia hit and the amputations? Were you one of these people when people look back and they say, oh, in hindsight, I always had problems with my eating or with depression, or were you very much just steady and happy before?
Yeah, absolutely. I was the second sort of group. Ate everything, ate anything. I was quite happy. Didn't have, I definitely didn't have that sort of a worry in my life at all growing up. And I think it probably was a combination of sport not being handled particularly well at that age group, and say hopefully things are now looking at coaching and the coaching that I'm starting to get into, and watching other people, that it is improving. Absolutely, awareness, and also just awareness of what people say and how they say it to younger athletes and female athletes. I think that is definitely turning into a much more positive dialogue between those that are growing up, and from my point of view, working with some of the younger athletes now, and athletes going into elite sport, whether Olympic, Paralympic, non-Olympic sports. It is definitely much more awareness shown, and I think just in all of the coaching that's available. So I do think that's really positive. It certainly wasn't easy at that point, and I think for me it was just a tip point between exams and sports and comments, and they just happened to come at a pinch point for me. Katie, you're on silent.
Muted again. When did you first realise that it was a problem for you and it wasn't just the relationship with food had got very, very unhealthy?
And it's funny actually. I really remember some things really clearly, and some things quite happily that I've shoved away. But yeah, I do remember there was some holidays after GCSEs. That was my point really, that it all spiraled, and it all just became about weight numbers and what numbers were going into you, like what you're eating, and I started restricting quite heavily what I would eat, as in the type of foods, and what I would do to sort of, I guess, equalize it in my mind. So I think that 16 years, 16, 17, so school into college first year was the point where it all unraveled. And it's funny, you do sort of say remember certain things. It's like when you're growing up, you remember sort of certain things that stick out in your mind, and I do remember also other people becoming quite aware but not knowing how to say things, and that then sort of makes you shut down even more and go into more of a tunnel vision approach about it as at that time. And again, it's really hard now for parents, it's really hard now for a sibling to talk about it to another sibling. So if you're going back 20 years, it's still it just wasn't spoken about, and they didn't know how to talk to you either.
Have we got Ollie back? Can we hear him now?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Great.
There we go. Yes. Wow. There we go.
Do you want to give us a quick summary then of your injury and how that ended your career?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me on, and obviously thank you to Rachel and Helen for sharing their story. Mine was slightly different. I've been doing sort of 12 years professional rugby player, a few different clubs, and had been with England for about 11 years and was captain of them for 6 years. And like everyone, we have a plan or a strategy or whatever that you want to do. And mine was going to be that I was going to stay within the England 7 squad, go to a World Cup in Moscow, and then I was going to play the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow and try and hang my boots up at the Rio 2016 Olympics. And I got injured in the final actually of the World Cup, and that was it. If I'm honest, this whole sort of 3-year plan came crashing down within about 3 hours. And they sort of said, look, you've severed the nerve in your calf, that's it, it's game over. And as a result, we're not going to give you your 3-year contract extension, etc., etc. So it was all a bit of a car crash, to be honest. And it took me quite a while before I sort of realised the psychological, mental impact of that. I leapt onto the first thing that was in front of me. I went and did the Clip Around the World race. So I went and sailed around the world for a year, went up to the North Pole, and it was only when I sort of came back from that I suddenly realised, how much hole was left in my life and all my identity, how it all was geared towards being a sportsman, being a rugby player. That was all my identity. I noticed it in my behaviour, the way I referred to things was like, I wouldn't say anything that I did now. I would say, oh, yeah, hi, I'm Ollie. I used to play rugby and things like that. So I went on a fairly rapid downward spiral from that point onwards, and it was a battle with some, I guess, new identity, mental health, etc., around actually how do I move on to the next phase or next iteration, if you like, of my life. And it took probably 18 months, maybe 24 months. It's still a work in progress, but certainly those are the really, really tough parts.
Could you mention that it took you a while to almost understand the impact on your mental health, but did you realise straight away that it was over, or was that something that took a while to adjust to when they told you the news?
Yeah, I sort of refused to acknowledge. Basically, medically, I felt like they'd just given up. I was only 29 at the time, so I sort of thought I still had a bit of time left in the tank. But yeah, I was more sort of disappointed at how the medics and everyone else around me had kind of sort of held their hands up and just given up. And it was the first time ever in my life where I'd had lots of injuries in the past, and they sort of tell you, right, this is what you've done, this is the rehab, this is how long it will take, and then you try and beat that time scale, and you come back within whatever time. They tell you 6 months, you try and do it in 4 months or whatever. But it's the first time ever they just were like, nah, it's done. And I was like, nah, that can't be the case. So I thought if I went and did all these ridiculous things, like went and sailed around the world, was gone for a year, I'd come back, my leg would have had time to recover, and I would be able to play again. And it just, it wasn't really the case. I was kind of living in denial, but also still sort of chasing, I guess, some of the amazing things, but also the addictive sides of being a sports person, right? Which is recognition, reward, adulation, praise, etc., that you get from being a somebody kind of thing, and that sort of fueled me going on to do these things without actually addressing some of the fundamental issues that were going on underneath me, of like, well, everything that I've identified myself as for the last 25 years. I played rugby since I was 4. Now wasn't going to be a part of my life anymore, in terms of playing and all that, and yeah, it just took a while to even sink in, let alone deal with it.
Helen, Ollie was talking there about how he had this 3-year plan, and then all of a sudden, within the space of a few hours, it's completely derailed. Were you able to plan when you were pregnant with Emily? Because I don't imagine that there were many role models that you were able to look for as a precedent of someone who'd come back after having a baby, or were there people that you could look at? How did you start to plan maybe your pregnancy and your return and the timing of it, if you did?
Yeah, again, with Emily, it was difficult with her being my first. I mean, I had ideas in my head of what the ideal would be. I was sort of fortunate that, as I said before, it was a summer league at the time that I was playing in, and it was a year that Wales didn't have any qualifying matches, so there was no sort of commitments, and I had her in the September, right at the end of the season, so I had a bit of time before the next one, so I was not really in as much of a rush, and it was kind of, I was able to almost just go with it. I didn't have to plan too much. It changed a bit with Charlie, because I had him right at the start of a qualifying campaign, right at the start of a season. He was again born in September, but we'd gone back to sort of a normal playing schedule where games started in August, September time. And having been through it before with Emily, I kind of had an idea of what my body might be capable of doing. But what I did learn quickly was that not only is every person different, but every pregnancy is always going to be at least slightly different. I was fortunate with both of them that they were quite straightforward in most ways, and I know that there's some really hard stories that I've heard of women in pregnancy and childbirth, but I was quite fortunate that both mine were quite straightforward, and that enabled me to be in quite a good place coming back to football. But yeah, it's so difficult to plan, really, because you've got one idea in your head and something happens and everything can totally change. And we've seen recently with Alex Morgan, who's one of the biggest superstars in women's football and probably has an untold amount of support in terms of physios, experts, resources around her to help her get back on the pitch as soon as possible. And I think it took her 6 months to step back on a football pitch. So, you hear different stories, but you just have to try not to compare yourself to other athletes and other people, because, like I said, it's with any injury as well. You're given sort of a broad time scale of when you might be able to be back, but everybody's bodies are so different. And while one person can do something super fast, it might take somebody else a bit longer. So you have to be quite kind to yourself and make sure you're doing everything right by your body's time scale and time frame. And that's probably the more difficult side of it, because it's the mental side of trying to get over, something not going quite so well, or, am I too far ahead, or whatever. You're constantly questioning yourself.
And how did you get by in terms of support? Because you mentioned the Wales physio that identified that you'd had ab separation, but what was the support around you, and how much of it was geared up to supporting someone coming back from pregnancy?
And yeah, it was. I mean, I can't fault anybody that I was around at either time, but it wasn't their fault that they hadn't really been through it before. I have to say, at Watford with Charlie, I'd only just rejoined the club, and our sports scientist Mickey, who's still there now, he made a real effort and a conscious effort to go and do some research into sort of returning to play after pregnancy, and I have to give him a lot of credit for doing that, because he didn't have to. He could have just said, well, this is my knowledge, I'm going to kind of go with what I know surrounding other potential injuries or rehab programs and try and piece it together. But he made a real conscious effort to go out and read papers and speak to other professionals and get as much help as he could to then help me. So I'm really grateful for that. And as well with Wales, as I said, the physios were really supportive, and also Beth Lloyd, our strength and conditioning coach there, had trained as a personal trainer in post and prenatal training. So she had a really good basis that I was able to, with Charlie, have a program throughout the pregnancy, very much geared around strengthening my whole body and taking it as hard as or easy as I needed to at any one point. But she was a real good person to lean on. So I'm very grateful for the support that I did have. But I know that's not always been the case at every club or every organisation. So I think now things are probably changing, and there's more sort of scope for clubs and organisations to have people in place to deal with that sort of thing. And I'm glad that it's becoming a much more normal subject of women having children while still continuing in their sport.
Rachel, what about your support? So when did other people start to find out about it, and who were the first people that you started to reach out to within sport for advice and help?
Into college and carried on running, and I literally ran myself into the ground. And it's interesting, Helen saying about like each person's body is different, and you come back from an injury differently. You don't all come back on the same time frame. There's so many variants in everybody returning from anything. It's just like a common cold. Everyone has maybe 6 days, 4 days ill or feeling unwell, and I think that probably became quite obvious looking back on it now, just how much I was able to push myself into the ground literally and run on empty. I kind of call it running on empty, because at that point it was and it was a total mind game. And I guess in some ways I do think I took an awful lot from it after that, with the challenges that I've had physically. I think that it taught me to be really hard in some ways, in a good way, and also know when my line is that I'm not okay at, and I do need to ask for help from, whereas at that point I couldn't, and I don't think I probably even knew the words that I needed help at that point. As your weight drops, you get to a certain point when it's not just about people giving you compliments and saying, "Oh, you're looking great, you've lost weight," or that really those really little easy comments that people make can actually have quite a big impact at that point as well on people. And it's trying to know from the outside, looking at somebody, it's really hard to know whether it's just a healthy losing weight to start with, and often it is, and then where is that point when it goes from being healthy to becoming unhealthy, and then that point from being unhealthy to where it becomes actually that it's an illness, and then where is it? The final line is like, where is it from an illness to becoming dangerous and life-threatening, and ultimately eating disorders are. And I think that it certainly has ended up giving me skills. So I guess you kind of have to look at it in a good way as well. It sort of gave me good things as well to be able to manage with afterwards.
What about actually reaching out for help? Can you remember the first person that you told, generally or within the sport?
It was one of the athletics coaches I had at the time, and I guess she was amazing, and she was brilliant, and then you can kind of see the two approaches, because I had one who was absolutely fantastic in a local athletics club, and then one who was really pushing to try and get me to a different level, and the way that they were doing it was, I guess, chalk and cheese in that sense, and the way that she, in a positive way, helped was, I guess, she gave me the opportunity in the end to be able to talk, and she almost gave me the sort of setup and the words to be able to sort of say that she knew what was happening, and I think that was also easier because actually from a family point of view and relatives, it's really, really hard as well to have those conversations. Once you get to that point, you tend to get quite reactive in a defensive way, and it's really hard. So I think probably for me, having somebody that was outside of my family to have that conversation was really helpful as well, for it to start at least anyway.
Ollie, you were talking about how it's taken a while for you to reconfigure your life as not a rugby player, and you've always talked about yourself as, I used to play rugby, because it was this thing that was a part of your life since you were a little boy. What about when you first quit the game? Did you have a lot of support, or was it like once you quit rugby, you're out of there and you're on your own?
I think it definitely felt like the latter more. I didn't think I didn't think there was a huge amount of support around that progression out of it. I also think I guess maybe you're a bit stubborn as well on certain things, because you don't want to sort of acknowledge that it is kind of all over and that you are sort of out of that framework. So you kind of close yourself off a little bit to some of the help or support from your friends or whatever that might be asking you, and it's quite sort of classic for most people, and probably quite a British thing. When people say you're right, you just say yeah, I'm fine, thanks, yeah, I'm great. But I would have suggested overall that the general level of support wasn't particularly great. I was just very grateful and thankful that actually 2 years after, when I sort of started to dawn on me that from a behaviour perspective, I was really not in a good place, and I was being sort of quite destructive for myself and for my future. Right? I mean, I wasn't. I just wasn't sure what I was doing, or like how I could tell from my behaviour and the way I was behaving on a day-to-day basis that this wasn't good. And thankfully, there was our Players Association, the Rugby Players Association, the RPA, that I reached out to and just said, look, guys, I don't really know what's going on, but I don't think I'm in a very good place, and I think I need some help. And is there anyone I could talk to? Is there anything that we're doing in this space? And luckily for me, there was, and they put me in touch with a company called Cognacity, which was a therapist or a counsellor, and I started my journey, or my transition, if you like, my evolution away from sort of being a sportsman into the next stage of my career, and just getting comfortable, if you like, with the fact that my life wasn't going to be in that arena anymore. And that was I was lucky for that. To be honest, I was grateful that the RPA were there, because if not, I probably would have been behaving and doing exactly the same things, and I would be in a very different place than I am today, and probably very unhappy, but equally very unaware as to how I could actually resolve it.
What did your day-to-day life look like once you were out of the rugby sphere?
I just filled it with like basically anything and everything and anyone that would give me some form of attention and recognition. Mine was in relationships. Like I'm not into booze. I'm not into drugs. So my vice was around all the things that I got from sport that suddenly were missing that rugby used to give me, which was every day you get feedback from a coach, you get the support or camaraderie of everyone around you, you get appraisal and recognition and reward from fans, from coaches saying you're good, you're bad. They give you focus areas to work on. We would get every weekend the opportunity to right those wrongs or do it all again, get that huge adrenaline boost that you get from playing in front of 10,000, 50,000, 80,000 people. And all of that just went. And I just sought that in any way I could from anyone or anything, whether that was multiple relationships that I would just be so self-destructive in, or in my job that I was doing, I wasn't really engaged around my job, but I would just try and get 20 people to tell me that they thought I'd be great and pull me under their wing, but I had no intention of ever really being able to deliver on it or be capable of delivering on it. And it was just this downward spiral of needing to feel recognised and letting everybody down all the time, feeling pretty underwhelmed and underachieving about the whole sort of thing, and then it just being a vicious cycle all the way through. So that was how it sort of played out for me, and I was trying to really. The counselling for me was about understanding my tells, where this need for recognition, adulation, emotion stem from, and then being able to sort of manage it, control it, if you like, to a certain degree, so that I could, I could be comfortable in my own skin.
Helen, we saw Charlie popping up a second ago there. What was the biggest challenge for you to balancing motherhood and new motherhood with trying to get back in and be a footballer again?
Yeah, I think it's probably the same for quite a few professions, to be honest. Childcare is the biggest thing, and the sort of guilt that you feel around going back to work or training or whatever it might be, and trying to find someone to look after your children. And I think for me with football, because for such a long time football for me was a hobby, it was something I enjoyed doing, it almost made me feel more guilty to go and do it, although it had become my job at that point. It always felt like, because football is sport, to be able to do that as a job is the best thing in the world. You almost feel like you can't consider it as a real job. So for me to have to find childcare and ask people to look after the kids for me to go and play football, I almost felt bad. Whereas if I was going to sit down and do an office job, and I have to go to work, and everybody knows I don't really want to do it, but she has to do it, we'll get round her and we'll look after the kids. So I think, although that was all in my own head, because my parents, my husband, and his parents and everybody else that's rallied round have always been fully supportive of my football career, and they understood that I needed to carry on playing and I needed to do what was best for me, which was trying to get back on a football pitch. I was really fortunate to have that, but I certainly did find it very tough, and I still do find it tough, going away with Wales, and my husband still working full time, and the children sort of being packed off to my mum and dad as well. There's that whole guilt around it, and I think that's probably the overriding feeling that I've had in the years since becoming a mum is the guilt on both sides, both for the kids, going away from them, but also he's just crying on the floor at the moment, but also the guilt that I'm relying on so many other people as well.
Rachel, I was interested, Ollie was talking about his experiences of counselling. What were the things that you learned in terms of what was triggering your eating disorders? What sort of stuff did you do in those sessions? I think we're struggling to hear you, Rachel. I don't know if you're on mute or if it's just your bandwidth is low.
Oh, no, we can't hear Rachel, no.
Yeah, we can't hear.
I'm the least tech person, but I always feel like I have a duty to Rachel. I'll try and have a look if I can get in the back end and help your audio. There's a question that's just come in, and I don't want to steal Katie's thunder actually, that was for Rachel. For Ollie, how tough was it to adjust, leaving an incredible career, leaving the limelight, and how is the transition mentally from fame to being out of the spotlight? I think to an extent you already sort of answered that, and you mentioned that you replaced it with different things. But I mean, the transition itself, I recall when we first spoke, it didn't sort of come straight away, the challenge, did it? I'm going to dive off, by the way, and let you pick that up if I may.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. I think is it Mark Porter? Thanks very much for the question. I mean, as everyone on this call, I mean, Rachel, Helen, will probably attest to being in the world of sort of professional sport, representing your country, etc., etc. It's a huge privilege and an accolade, but it's obviously it's a massive addiction too, right? There's nothing more infectious and incredible than that feeling of standing and like hearing the national anthem or looking at the emblem on your chest and just knowing that you've kind of fulfilled like a childhood dream that you probably never thought would be achievable or whatever else, and suddenly it was your reality, right? And then when all that vanishes, all you crave are those moments. All you crave are those huge moments of massive endorphin, even the huge lows of wins, losses, just shared moments with amazing people that it's just so difficult to replicate. I transitioned out and I ended up working for a company called PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, and I just found it so difficult to even compute what my value was and what my worth was in the organisation. I could, if I were to translate what I could do, I could run up and down the stairs faster than anybody else. I could probably knock more people over at a photocopying machine than anyone else, but I didn't really think that brought any value to anyone at PwC. So I've just felt like a bit of a fake, to be honest, and totally out of my comfort zone and really struggling to understand what my self-worth was, and equally at the same time obviously craving that moment again, that energizer, that moment of euphoria and just everything about it and brilliance. And I found that really, really difficult just to come to terms with that wasn't ever going to happen again. And equally that I probably might not find that feeling ever again, or how could I frame that all over again? And the limelight, the spotlight is all about that. But I think it's also just around the sense of just feeling really, really good at something, like just being so confident and competent in your own ability to do something, and then that not being possible anymore. There's not many jobs that I know of that you basically just can't do anymore, full stop. Like it just stops. And I just found that really, really difficult when all I knew was that. Everything that was familiar to me was that. All of my friends were involved in that. All of my identity, my, whatever I call it, my brand, my personal brand was all rugby. And I just didn't feel, even though I still was sort of associated with it, I just didn't feel very authentic, and I didn't feel like I was that person anymore, and I struggled to manage with coming to terms with that.
How much planning had you actually done as a player for what was going to come afterwards, or was it just something that you always thought that day will never come?
I used to get a lot of flack actually from all the boys, because I used to spend a lot of time sort of networking and whatever. So I was, and having captained England and whatever, you meet a lot of influential people and helpful people or whatever that might kind of set you up for your future career. So I guess I had a relatively decent network, but I had no idea what I wanted to do, or like what would be that follow on. As far you always talk about it, of course. Everyone's always like, you should plan for this, and you should go and take up guitar lessons, and go and do an accounting thing or whatever. But you're all like, yeah, I'll do it. But it doesn't really hold any relevance, and it doesn't really tick the same boxes that running around on a sports field does for you, right? So yes, okay, there were things that contacts that were in place, but a bit like I mentioned at the beginning, like I just had no real idea as to actually how that was relevant, or how I was going to actually be competent, useful, qualified in that area, and probably more importantly, and how I was even going to find that interesting. Why was that even going to be relevant and interesting for me? And the fallout from that, the psychological fallout from that was, like, I just don't feel like I want to do anything else. I don't feel like I've got any self-worth, and therefore I might as well not be here. And that's when it gets dark, and that's when it gets tough, and and that's when real mental health issues start to creep in, right? And that's where you need to. And luckily, I had the support of the RPA and the people at Cognasti to really help me sort of wrestle with that, manage through that, and equally understand where that was all sort of coming from and what that was rooted in, and sort of get control of that.
Rachel, if you keep your camera off, it might be a little bit easier to hear you, but Ollie was obviously talking to there about some of the things that he works on in his sessions and understanding his triggers and why he was feeling the way he was feeling. What conclusions did you come to around your triggers and what was causing your eating disorder in your sessions?
We've lost her.
Yeah.
Oh, there she's back, but we haven't got any noise. Haven't got any sound from you, Rach. Sorry.
We'll try and get Rachel back on ASAP. We are going to have a quick break in a second anyway. I'll let Katie introduce it, but we'll try and get Rachel on ASAP because she's got so much to offer. And I mean, there's loads of questions as well for her. So we'll do our very best to get her back on ASAP.
Yeah, we'll just take a quick break for a few minutes then to watch some videos from the 3 charities that are involved today.
Fergus has probably only been invited to one birthday party in the whole of his life, and I have to say when that happened I think I burst into tears because I couldn't believe actually somebody invited to one birthday party in the whole of his life, and I have to say when that happened I think I burst into tears because I couldn't believe actually somebody had invited him to a party. So Fergus didn't have any play at all in that time, and I didn't even know what he was missing out on really because we didn't know anything about challenges then.
We would have struggled to cope, I think, the first year without challenges because there wasn't really any other respite.
Us as a family can have some sort of normality.
It's been a godsend to my boys, absolutely. It's not just a play scheme, it's not just a preschool, it's a life for your child that they maybe wouldn't otherwise get?
I can't really imagine life without challenges now. I'm not sure I'd be sitting here now. I really can't imagine, because it sounds corny, but it has been a big part of our lives and getting us to where we are now, really.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to say a quick word about the Ollie Foundation. Ollie stands for One Life Lost is Enough. We are a suicide prevention training charity. We work with young children in relation to their well-being and their resilience, and then working with businesses and organisations and all blue light professionals, because sadly most of us do not get taught how to support ourselves or one another when it comes to emotional crisis. Please just check out our website, because we have a calendar on there full of all the training that we're offering, and you can book on for free to anything that looks useful. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who got us involved with this event. So first of all, thank you, Amy, and all the students at the university. Thank you so much. This is such an exciting event and so very, very important. The hidden needs, the experiences that people go through need to be shared to make it okay to reach out, to make it okay to ask for help. So good luck with what you're doing today. Huge thanks to everyone, particularly your speakers, and Helen for nominating the Ollie Foundation. Thank you.
COVID-19 has a devastating impact on children and young people with disabilities.
Freddie Farmer has been determined since the day he was born to achieve his...
COVID-19 has a devastating impact on children and young people with disabilities.
Freddie Farmer has been determined since the day he was born to achieve his dream of playing football. But cerebral palsy needs intensive physiotherapy.
To be honest, it's amazing that Wooden Spoon has helped us all this time, because without charities like the Wooden Spoon, we would be struggling, but instead we're helping all these children that need it, like me. They're getting the help they need thanks to the Wooden Spoon, and I couldn't thank them enough.
Freddie can now stand for small periods at a time and kick a football with his big brother. His dream is one day to play a match with him.
And then when I'm doing my physio, I think this is boring, but when I'm in front of the stadium doing it, it won't be boring, and I will be on that pitch. Mark my words, I will be on that pitch.
Yeah, so those were the charities that we're supporting today. The first one, Challenges, is a children's charity that focuses on developing the physical and mental health of young athletes and tearing down some of the barriers that stop children and young people with disabilities from playing sports. The Ollie Foundation, Ollie stands for One Life Lost is Enough, and as we saw in the video there, a charity dedicated to delivering awareness and suicide prevention sessions around young people. And Wooden Spoon is a charity that seeks to help children and young people with disabilities through the medium of rugby and offer them opportunities to take part in different projects, including sensory rooms and outdoor activities and playgrounds. So thank you to the three speakers for nominating those charities. We'll come to Helen next for part two. What would your advice be to any athletes who are thinking about starting a family and maybe worried about how it will impact their career or their career trajectory?
I think firstly, speak to people that have done it. You'll be amazed when you go through it what your body and your mind can do, and I think that's probably the thing that affects most women is the doubt that you have that you'll be able to get back to the level that you're at or even higher. And actually some of the physiological benefits of pregnancy are quite amazing. And again, I wasn't aware of them. Things like producing more red blood cells, which for a good year after birth is something that's going to really help with fitness levels. So I think if you're ready for a family, put that first and think about sport second. Of course, sport is a big part of many people's lives, and sometimes it's a bit daunting to try and put that behind something else. But if you're ready for a family, I'd say go for it. And there's nothing quite like taking to the field or the track or whatever it might be that you do, knowing that you've got a little one or a couple of little ones there sort of supporting you as well. So I think it adds a lot to you as a person. Obviously, parenthood does that to anyone, but I think as a sports person especially, I found it really nice having two kids to, not only bring me up and cheer me on, but also when I come home from a bad performance or a bad result, they're there to sort of welcome me with open arms no matter what. And it's quite nice to come home to that sort of unwavering support and the almost not really caring what happens on the pitch, because at the end of the day, I'm just their mum, and that's the most important thing to them. So yeah, I'd say go for it, but speak to people that have gone through it, and you'll be amazed at what you can do.
I can see the questions stacking up in the chat, so we'll have a question and answer session at the end. But obviously, with Helen having to rush off at some point to do her Watford duties, we'll get to those ones a little bit earlier. Rachel, have we got you back yet?
She's currently typing on the chat, though, Katie. So
right,
she's there as well. So if you post some questions, she can go back to them on that way.
We'll do that one. We'll do that then. Ollie, if we come to you, when did you start to be able to piece everything back together and get your life?
Great. Well, I mean, I guess it was the start of the process was like probably 2.5 years after I'd retired. So that's where it really started to land. I had some fairly sort of life-changing moments. For me, like my ex-girlfriend, she was pregnant. We unfortunately lost the baby on the day of the 12-week scan, and then from that, my behaviour just was not brilliant. I was just way too distant. I just couldn't deal with that whole process, really, that whole sort of scenario and system. And I think that was the start of the recognition of my kind of like downward spiral in terms of the behaviours that I sort of elicited, and I was probably the stereotypical person that would be like, oh, it's not my fault, it's something wrong with them or whatever else. Just basically not really willing to do a bit of sort of self-assessment and actually look deep down as to whether I was the root of some of these problems. And so that was the start of it for me. It was probably then another 2 years until I actually really felt like I got control back in my life, and that I really understood what I was doing and why I was, what caused some of these issues and some of these behavioural sort of changes in me, and then equally how I could manage and mitigate against them. And another one, probably for me was I actually then happened to meet someone that totally changed my outlook and my perspective on life, who now is the mother of our two kids and my wife. But at the time, I met someone that just really made me want to be a better person and want to deal with these things. And we initially sort of met, and then she quickly realised that I was a bit of a toe rag and not really worth hanging around with. So jogged me on for about 8 months and said, look, that's fine, but the way you behave and the way things are happening in your life at the moment, that's not who I am. That's not what I want to be. And she was right. And it was kind of the, whatever you want to call it, inspiration or moment that I kind of needed in my brain of like, I've got to keep pushing forward with this transition, this, I guess this, whatever, mental rehearsal in order to resolve the issues that I've got, because I've met someone that I know is the right person for me, but they're just not right now. If I went into this now, I totally mess it up. So thankfully we didn't. And thankfully she went for a drink with me 8 months later, as she agreed she would. And now we're married and 2 kids down. And, Helen will attest to that. That's an incredible experience, but also it's a seriously challenging one. But if I'd have done that whole process how I was post my playing career, I would be sadly probably divorced and have 2 kids that were going to be in a broken home. And thankfully, I can only see it being an incredible future for me and my family. So that was, a major outcome and a major hurdle overcome.
Helen, how aware are your kids of your playing career?
Fairly aware, considering. I mean, Charlie's only 3, but he I put on certain clothes or certain kit, and he says football, so he knows that that's what I do. And Emily, obviously, she's a bit older and has a bit more sort of knowledge of it. So they're pretty involved. They don't always want to come and watch, especially if it's raining or cold outside. Then they're not always there on the sideline. But yeah, I don't think they understand quite perhaps the level that I've played at, maybe what international means and that kind of stuff. But yeah, they know that football is my thing and is a part of my job. And for me, that's kind of enough. I'm not too worried what else they may think of it as a career, in terms of what I've done or what I might not have done. But yeah, they're I suppose about as aware as a 3 and a 6-year-old can be.
What does good support look like for you? Not just in terms of, you mentioned obviously your family stepping in with childcare, but from a club perspective and a football perspective, what have you found to be the best and the most supportive things that clubs and coaches?
Just an understanding, really, because it's not always the case, and I think at some places you can feel like you're a burden because you're a mother, and that all the kids are going to get in the way again, and it's more hassle than it's worth to have somebody within a squad or a club who has children. But for me, I'm as I've mentioned already, I'm very fortunate that both with Watford and with Wales, I've had really good support in that they understand that sometimes, not very often, and I try to, make sure it doesn't get in the way, but sometimes there will be occasions where I'm not able to be somewhere, or I can't be somewhere until slightly later, or anything like that. They understand it and they don't make me feel bad for that. And that's the biggest thing. It's the peace of mind that I know that if anything does happen, then I'm not going to sort of be punished for it, if you like. But as I said, I try to make sure that those sorts of things don't happen, but it's nice knowing that I have that peace of mind if it does, and if I need to be away from football at any point because of a family situation, it's just nice to know that I've got that support.
Rachel, it looks like, I don't know if James can shed some light on the situation, but
Rachel, I mean, here I am, technical advisor for the day. Rachel's just jumped out for a reset. She is going to try and come back in and reset the mic. But just so we've got the equilibrium on the screen, I'll just add a face and I'll sit here passively unless you want me.
Yeah, in the meantime, it looks like Rachel's answering some of the questions in the chat, so we'll sort of keep her there and hopefully we'll be able to talk to her at some point. But Ollie, when did you start? Because obviously you mentioned the influence of your family and your partner and things like that, but in terms of the job, you talked about going there and not really knowing about your skills and things like that. Would you have done anything differently looking back, or are you quite happy with the way that you've handled things or how stuff?
I think I've been incredibly lucky or fortunate, if you like, the way that things have turned out to be at a place like PwC, right? It's a big company, it's a good brand, etc., and they've been very kind and good to me. What would I have done differently? I think I definitely would have invested a lot of time into just reflecting on what I want to do, like what is really authentic to for me, and what is the best representation of me moving forward, because I don't think I really thought about that, properly invested time and energy into reflecting on, okay, well, who and where where do you want to work, who do you want to work with, what's the kind of things that you'd like to do, what would be the the future state of Ollie Phillips post a playing career. I think if I'm honest, I probably just tried to get lots and lots of options, but didn't really think about which was the right one and the relevant one for me. So I think that would have really helped, because I think it would have built a lot of the excitement, and maybe acted as a better distraction of sort of a natural progression. Whereas my behaviour was basically that I just clung to everything I'd known in the past and being a sportsman and everything else in the past. So I think that would have really, really helped and aided that sort of situation. For me, I saw someone else on the group that Karina had asked around what made me want to go back into education, and that probably builds on that point, which is I hadn't really invested the time and energy into really understanding what I wanted to do, and here I was thrust into a PwC, and I needed to go and actually figure out what the hell the world of business meant, and what the options were out there, and what I could do, what I couldn't do, where I thought my skill sets then would be appropriate, and how I could maybe apply them to that. And so I went and did an MBA at Cambridge University, and that was one of the best things I did. One, for the network of people, but two, just to really understand what this word business meant. I just didn't. For me, business was basically going out on the weekend to make sure I didn't get my head kicked in, and we came away with a W at the end of it all, and hopefully I scored a couple of tries. But and it was sort of a very different context than what that meant for the broader world, and then I could drill down into what I actually liked about it, what I didn't like about it, and so that was all part of the process, if you like, and then also part of the transition and acceptance of okay, I've got to go and find a new skill, and equally accepting that I guess the euphoria and vibe and buzz that I got from being a sportsman and playing in the world of rugby was maybe not going to be replicated again, but it could manifest itself in different ways. Right? I was never going to get that feeling of 80,000 people at Twickenham singing the national anthem before I went out to play rugby. That just wasn't. We weren't going to get that, even if all 125,000 people of PwC that worked there turned up on the stairs and sang the national anthem. It wouldn't make it anywhere near the same impact, right? So it was just trying to channel my energies and accept that life was going to be different, right? And be grateful for what had gone before, rather than reminiscing and really missing it the whole time.
It looks like we've got Rachel back. Or not. Maybe if you take the camera off and then unmute yourself, it might just be less for the internet to sort of cope with. Can we hear you now?
No. It
doesn't look like. Oh, yep, we can hear you.
Can you?
She was just teasing Katie. We thought we got her. She got like 3 words, 4 words, and then we lost her.
What's going on? Can you hear it at all?
We can hear you now.
So you're there now. We can hear you.
Yay! This is really exciting. I'm so sorry.
Just the perils of working from home. Yeah. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about your recovery, and then when you started sort of pinpointing your triggers and things like that?
Okay, I'll leave the camera off. It's probably better for you anyway, so it's fine. I think it's a lot of what Ollie has said. I think that I resonate with really strongly. It's interesting that your experience with PwC, and I ended up doing a course they've developed, which have now ended up working with another company to develop it further, but it's specifically for that gap between sport, when you don't know how to you don't know how business works, you don't know how the real world works.
Chloe Dudding and everyone. Yeah, great program.
Yes. Oh, great. Yeah. And I was the first para athlete on it, and I was that first intake on that on the course they ran. And for me, that was probably one of the biggest points, although it's late in my career, that was actually probably one of the biggest points of realization that I wasn't just an athlete. I wasn't just the person with a gold medal. I wasn't just an athlete. It was really quite a big moment over that course, where I was able to realise who I was beyond an athlete, and it sort of taught me, I guess, the things that I actually enjoy doing. It taught me about what I wanted to go, where I wanted to go with perhaps the real world of work a bit more as well. And I've also been able to stay on as an athlete longer, I think probably because of it. And at the moment, I'm still in that. I am kind of walking a bit of a fine line between retiring, just because I actually started to realise that live when you do leave sport, which is something I just hadn't realised or been able to see before. Katie, I can't remember quite what you said, sorry, about your last question. By that point, I went off on a tangent, Ollie, sorry.
We loved it.
That's fine then.
I'm muted now. It was just about when you first started going into therapy and counselling, what you sort of learned about yourself and why you were having the problems.
Sorry. Okay. So I think a lot of it, again, sort of slightly ties back into, I think when you go into sport quite young, there are some really amazing things that you take out of sport. And Ollie, you're going into rugby at 4. I don't know how old you were, Helen, when you went into sport. But when you start on that pathway, although you get to develop incredible skills in that sports arena and in that sort of drive or that pathway forwards, and that you do lose, obviously you sacrifice other things. I don't like the word sacrifice really, because you actually get amazing things that other people never get to experience because of sport. But equally at the same time, you don't get some of the other growing up normal sort of things that people take for granted. And I think for me, there was a part of, I didn't quite know where I fitted. There's a really big part of, I was absolutely happy as an athlete. I knew my drive, I knew my focus, I knew what I wanted to achieve. And actually, even though obviously I changed track from Olympic to Paralympic, ultimately to me, I was still an athlete, and I'd got that, all the skills I'd learned at that point as an athlete were able to be translated and just go across to still be an athlete, but just one was using my arms for everything. I think that there was a big body image for me, a big part of that was tied up. I was a sprinter. I didn't look girly at that age. When you're kind of going into teens, I was chunky, because I had muscle, and I didn't fit into what the rest of the girls were within my kind of year at that time. There weren't any athletes around that were that. They were netballers and like kind of the normal sort of sports athletes, girls, I think, in that sense, or the gymnastic ones, the ones that were into dance, but not into sort of the power sports as much. And so I just, for me, I think I just didn't fit in the way that other people perhaps saw me. So it ended up taking lots of really good things from sport and through that therapy point or the counselling point at that time, which then has given me an awful lot going forwards as well, to be able to sort of, cope with things.
I'll just ask a question to Helen, because I'm aware she's got to vanish in 10 minutes or so. There's a question for you in the chat from Dave, and he says, was there a point at which you thought becoming a mother would end your career, or you were always totally convinced that you would make it back to play?
Certainly. I always imagined that I would, once I was ready to have children, I wouldn't play anymore. Maybe because I hadn't seen many people do it, so it might have just been sort of ingrained into my mind. But as soon as I found out I was pregnant, I was determined to come back, because I realised, having, sort of the prospect of not training and playing, I realised I wasn't ready to give it up. So it was always, as soon as it actually happened, it was always something I wanted to do. And that was the same both times round. I always said after Emily that, I'm never doing that again. It's too hard, mentally and physically. But again, when it came to it, when I found out I was pregnant, I thought, no, I'm still not ready to let go. You go sort of, you end up telling people, not doing it again, not going to come back. And, something within me kept pulling me back to the game. So it sort of, both answers to that question. Yes, I thought that it would be the end of my career, but then when it actually happened, I knew that I couldn't let it be the end of my career, because I was determined that I needed to get back to the pitch, because it was what I knew and what I loved, and I wasn't ready to let that go.
And there's another question for you, Helen. It says, upon returning to competitive sport, are you the same athlete, or have things changed physically or mentally in any?
Again, probably both. As I mentioned briefly earlier, that your body goes through several changes, and you learn how resilient your body can be, for one thing, and what you can put yourself through. So I think that's probably given me a new level of determination to push my body to new physical limits. But also, you know, so that's sort of a mental and a physical aspect. But mentally, again, going back to having two children, that no matter what the score, no matter what the result or performance, I come home and they're going to want the same me. It lets me leave things a lot more than I used to. I used to be in a bad mood for days, or, you know, up until the next game or training session, I'd be in a foul mood if something hadn't gone right. But I'm not able to do that now, and I think that's quite a good thing to leave it behind. That's not to say that performances and results don't matter to me as much anymore. They certainly do. But I'm able to let them go a little bit easier and put it into perspective a bit more, which I think has helped me as I've got older. You know, I'm probably a bit kinder to myself in that sense. That really, in the grand scheme of things, it is sport, and it doesn't matter when you compare it to other things. So yeah, it's certainly changed both mentally and physically for me.
I'm just going to run through because I'm aware you've got to dash in about 10 minutes, Helen, but there are just quite a lot of questions come through for you. One of them is from Imogen, who's a teaching assistant in a primary school, and she says that you mentioned earlier that a sports professional did some research on return to sport after pregnancy. I think that was the guy at Watford that you were mentioning. And she said, do you think that the growth of women's sport effects of pregnancy should be more of a main focus in university courses or professionals anyway?
I think so. I think it's becoming much more of a normality now that women want to have children in the middle of a sporting career, and for that reason I think it should be sort of showcased a bit more, whether that's in terms of, you know, the research and medical knowledge behind it, but also the encouragement for people to do it. I found that myself, and actually when I was having Charlie, I was in the middle of a degree in sports writing and broadcasting, and one of my modules meant that we had to do a blog, an online blog, and create a blog that we updated regularly. And so I decided to create one surrounding training as an elite athlete while pregnant. So that actually really helped me as well, because I had to go out and do a lot of research. But what I did learn is that there isn't a lot, or at least there's not enough out there at the moment. So I certainly think that there should be certainly more things within, you know, whether it's education, you know, from a school or a university point of view, but just in general, I think there should be more awareness surrounding women who train and compete whilst pregnant, because it can be done and it is safe to do so, but there always seems to be a bit of a taboo around that subject.
And there's another question for you from Dave. I think we're all wondering this one. He says, with such a busy life, how do you still manage to find time to take or do you still find time? I thought he was going to say, how do you balance it both? But he says, do you still manage to find time to take your own children to their sports or their activities?
Again, yeah, it's tough. At the minute, obviously right now, they haven't got any activities to go to, but they haven't actually joined any clubs themselves yet. I am keen to get Emily in particular at her age into some sort of sporting or social sort of club when things allow us to do that, and that is something that's going to have to be considered, because obviously weekends are taken up with football. But, you know, I will make sure I find the time to do that. With Charlie, I'm hoping to get him into some sort of little kickers in the morning before he goes to nursery, perhaps. So yeah, I think you have to try and make the time, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that your priorities change, and, you know, I can't be the same selfish athlete as I once was, and I'm going to have to put their needs first. So yeah, that is something that's definitely on the agenda, although I haven't got round to it just.
Muted again. Thank you so much for joining us today, Helen, and we'll let you disappear to go and do your Watford duties.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and really interesting to hear from Ollie and Rachel as well, so thank you.
We'll just let Helen disappear, and then we'll just sort of direct a few questions to Rachel, because obviously we lost her for so long. a few questions have sort of come through on the sheet here. How did it actually impact your mental health when you were having and suffering from your eating disorder?
I think that it means that, I guess as an athlete, Helen said then that she changed, her priority changed with being a mum, and I think that in the wrong way that happens with that in your head with an eating disorder. I think you become more and more selfish within it. You don't mean it isn't meant in that way, but you become more and more wrapped up into it because you don't see any other way of doing anything, and you can't see a way out of it, and so you actually shut down to so many other things that you probably go the other way, the way that Helen was talking about in that sense. It means you don't have a lot of space to think properly, and you find that your brain is really just focused and just thinks about food or what you're going to do or how you're going to get away with it or how you're going to get around it, really becoming very obsessively thought about. I kind of always used to think of it a bit like feeling like I was in a washing machine with all of those sort of thoughts that were going around my head, and there was no way to get them out. They were just sort of stuck in there. I think it just takes away a lot of the ability to think, and then you lose that rational decision making because it takes over your brain in that sense. And so that's also one of the reasons why people find it so hard to then talk or ask for help, because you become so terrified by the fact that you don't think there's any other way out of it, and there's no other way of managing anything. And so that means that you are even less able to ask for help, or at the start when often the first time somebody asks you if you're right or if something's actually up, or a direct question, you will find that most people will not answer you honestly, and it's about being the friends that are around you or the family around you are often the ones that are going to end up able to get in a bit to start with and allow somebody else to sort of feel safe enough to be able to talk to you. So if somebody does, if you're worried about somebody, don't give up at the first point. Don't make it don't attack at somebody, but equally don't give up on somebody because they're not going to probably talk the first time.
When did you start to get control of your mental health and your eating disorder?
I've definitely had times when I've had really, really good years and really, really good times when I have had, I would have thought, I'd say complete control over it, and it's not controlled me. I don't know, I think you always end up probably with 5%, I reckon, that you can never get rid of. And so you've always got to be slightly on guard. You start recognising the patterns in yourself. You recognise, a bit like Ollie's sort of saying about how when you retire or when you come into that point, you don't know quite how to do it. I think there's often patterns that you can associate once you start falling apart, or once you start not knowing how to manage something, you do start recognising things in yourself. And so when you get to a certain point, I don't know, say 70% better or something, you would get to the point where you can then manage and stay on a plateau for a bit, then you'll get a bit better and you'll keep on getting better. But equally, there is likely to be a trigger and something that's going to knock you back down again, but then you're going to recognise that quicker each time, and so the chances are you'll then get back on it and be able to control it again much quicker than it taking control of you.
And last question from me before we go to the questions in the chat for both of you. How did it start to impact your professional career and your sports career, or was it something that you were always able to keep hidden?
I think that's probably one of the very fine lines that a lot of people walk in that sense. In the rowing world, you tend to notice lightweight rowers because of the weight categories, and so a lot of those guys tend to struggle and walk a very fine balance between being really, really healthy athletes and kind of falling off the edge, the other side of it, and it becoming an eating disorder that's controlling them. I definitely found that, like, when I went into rowing, I was in a much better place, and than I had been, say, 2 years before cycling. And then I think that, again, I think my identity changed as that's one of the complex things of changing sports. I think I get really good things from changing sports, absolutely, and that's why I do it. But equally, at the same time, it does get a bit confusing, I think, because sports have very different setups. And I didn't realise that sport was set up so differently between sports, all under the umbrella term of UK sport. I had no idea when I first changed sports just how different that was going to be, and how different coaching was going to be, how different just the ways people engaged with you, there's a very different ethos behind sports. And I think for me that was one of the things that sort of I found really hard within rowing. I loved the discipline, I loved the hard work, I loved the focus and the drive within it. But equally, for me, that probably is also quite a fine line to walk between being really good with that and sort of taking over too much and becoming really obsessively part of everything.
We'll come into the questions in the chat now and bring you back in, Ollie. There's a question from Dave for you, and he says, what did you find to replace the adulation and praise that was suddenly missing in your life after the injury?
Well, the honest answer is I didn't. I didn't. I tried everywhere and anywhere to find it, and my vice, if you like, or my downfall was, as I said, I wasn't into drinking. I wasn't into drugs. I didn't smoke, so I didn't have any of those vices. But mine came in the form of I sought mine in relationships, right? So I couldn't just. I know this sounds a bit ridiculous, and some people will scoff at this, but like mine came in the form of just I needed to be around like multiple people all the time, so I couldn't just have like one partner like on a. I need to see like 3 different people because I would get so much different feedback, emotion, love, affection, adulation out of it, and then it would quickly obviously dissipate because you settle into that, and then you need these huge emotional highs again, and I'd sort of search that out left, right, and centre, and it became this sort of massive self-destructive process, right, where I was hurting people, I was hurting myself, and and I was disappointing myself, and obviously then these people would be upset or disappointed with me, and I would then try and chase after them to try and make them love me and like me again and whatever else. So it was just this, it was basically an explosion waiting to go off. It was a total recipe for disaster, and and as I say, the big day, the big moment for me was obviously my ex-girlfriend, who I'd had a relationship with before, just being outside the front of my door, crying her eyes out till 5 a.m. and sleeping on the doorstep of my house, and me just thinking, what am I doing? Like, what am I doing? This is not the person who I want to be. This is not the person who I promised to myself I would be. And here I am sort of staring at it in the face of this only goes one way, right? There's only one outcome of this, and whether it's now or whether it's in 10 years' time, unless you address the issue, address the problem, and try and tackle it, it's going to ruin my life, right? At some point in time. So at that point there, at that moment, I knew I needed to do something different, and I needed to go see someone, and I needed to stop basically kicking the can down the road and passing the responsibility on to somebody else, and actually address what all these insecurities were that I was going through and that I was feeling, and rather than just ignoring them and ultimately blaming them on somebody else.
Karina has a question for Rachel. She says, if I suspect that someone is suffering with bulimia, what advice would you offer them?
Can I give it a go with the camera and see if it's any good now? I don't know whether it's going to work. Is that all right? Can you hear? Okay,
yeah, we can
give
hear.
it a go. Fingers crossed, okay? I think that it's a really, really hard thing to do, to talk to somebody about it. I think being away, quieter, definitely from people. I think sometimes people try and talk to people within a sort of an environment where it's less threatening on one-to-one, whereas actually talking to somebody in a quieter environment is much, much better for something like that. I think at the moment is really, really hard. A lot of people are really struggling in lockdown anyway, irrespective of being an athlete, irrespective of anything else. Everyone is finding things really, really hard at the moment. I think having the conversations that perhaps we might have a bit more naturally at the moment between friends aren't happening. I've definitely noticed a number of people. I work with a number of people online for working with people who've got eating disorders and trying sort of working with them either in small groups or one-to-one. And I've definitely noticed an increase in the amount of people asking questions and how to support. We're not set up at the moment, apart from the fact that our eating disorder services are barely running, which means obviously there's a bigger backlog growing, bigger waiting list times, and that means that people are going to get, unfortunately, more ill before they end up getting the help. I think it is really hard to have these conversations on computer. Like, you only have to have one cutout like today, and if you start having to have that conversation with somebody and it cuts out, or I think it makes it really, really hard. So I think being there for people is a big thing at the moment, particularly. And you can work out a bit. You can kind of get a bit of a feeling from people about how they talk about food. So I think, just talking about food, you do pick up on whether somebody's having quite a negative feeling around it, whether they associate how they feel with what they're eating, and sort of things like the way that they are. Again, slightly harder at the moment when you're not with people, but people's nails often go quite dry. You get quite often sort of brittle hair as you're not getting enough nutrients and things in your body. Quite often, I know when people stand up they get dizzy sometimes, but actually going lightheaded quite sort of more extreme and quite noticeably sort of more often than perhaps they would do normally. Sort of things like that are sort of some of the things that I would definitely pick up. So becoming a bit more reclusive, not wanting to engage with them, and in just the normal things that they would do, sort of just becoming a bit quieter, shut in, shut down a bit. All of those I would sort of look at as being things that may well be not necessarily that you're into a full eating disorder either, but that you're perhaps heading down that pathway.
Claire has a question for you, Ollie. She says, is there anything you wish you knew before you were injured, and did you ever think that your career would end that way?
I don't think, well, I don't know, I guess maybe as a player, and Rachel might shed a bit on this, I think you're a bit ignorant. It's kind of, it'll come to an end at some point, right? It has to. I mean, there's no way it can't, but you just never really mentally prepare for it, I guess, because you just always think, just one more year. There's only a handful of players that I've ever met that were like, I left just when I was ready to go. Like I was done, and it was the perfect time for me. So many of them are like, I miss it, I wish I could do more or whatever. There's only a few that I ever speak to that are like, nah, I was broken, I was done, it was perfect. Like it was exactly how I wanted to go. So I think that's probably, when you live the dream kind of thing, it's kind of difficult to bring that, to wake up, if that makes sense. So there's probably that part, and then also, at 29, you always build these grand plans. I think, if I'd have got to the Olympics and done that in Rio, would I have been at that point? Yeah, I'm ready to rock and roll. I don't know, maybe. I mean, I told myself that that was going to be the end at that point, but I don't know. They ended up winning a silver, so maybe I'd be like, let's have one more hurrah and try and get a gold. So, I mean, who knows? I don't know, but I think equally, what would I have done differently, or what would I do when I was during my playing career? I would have made sure. I mean, don't get me wrong, I loved it more than anything in the world, but I think particularly at the start of my career, when I was really trying to sort of get into the squad and whatever else, and earn my stripes and whatever. So probably between 22 and 25. I was probably just a bit too harsh on myself. I was just full of like worry and anxiety and fear of like, I just don't want to mess something up. Like, I've got one shot, I'm in the team, I've got to make sure I stay in the team. Like, I've got to live right, I've got to eat right, I've got to sleep right, I've got to drink right, I've got to, don't do this, don't do that, just filling my life with like just anxiety, like rather than just reveling and loving the moment of like, wow, this is what I'm doing, this is what I've dreamt all about, and just going out and enjoying myself. I was so worried about like getting it wrong and therefore not being able to do any more of it. It was almost sort of like always trying to prepare for the next game rather than just enjoying and reveling in the current. So if I were to tell myself one thing from back then, it would have been, mate, just chill out. I mean, chill out, enjoy it, revel in it, really just embrace this amazing opportunity that you've got. And it was only after I left England and went to sign for a team in Paris, Stade Francais, and it suddenly made me realise, like, this is just wicked. Like, this is the dream, right? And I'm having such a brilliant time. I'm living for the moment, and I'll figure tomorrow out tomorrow. I'll have a good. It was a classic quote that someone told me, which is obviously a bit of a mouthful or whatever else. But they say, yesterday's history, tomorrow's a mystery, but today's the present. That's why they call it a gift. So, and I was like, actually, I love that, and I'm gonna just sort of live by that now. And when it comes to an end, it comes to an end. But when it eventually came to an end, obviously I just wasn't ready for the dream, the roller coaster ride to finish at that point. So.
Claire has got a question for you, Rachel. She says, do you think enough is being done now to support the mental health and well-being of players and athletes? And do you know of any organisations that support people with those issues?
I think it's, if I'm really honest at the moment, I think it's a real tick box exercise. I think it's starting to improve. I don't mean that to sound negative to people that are making a difference at all, because there are people that are there are people that are out there that are changing things and looking at changing it. But at the moment, it's still very much so in sports where, again, creating awareness is absolutely fantastic as well, but there's a difference between awareness and actually dealing with it and actually changing it as a pathway for athletes, or as a way that they know how to actually access it. And I think when you have to talk potentially to people in a squad to be able to access help, and you know that you don't trust that, although it's confidential, it's meant to be confidential, you don't trust within the team that it's going to stay within the person that it's meant to, it's really hard to access it. And so yes, help is definitely improving out there, but I think it's still much more about awareness, and things like some of the training out there. Again, as I say, it is awareness, and if it starts conversations, that's fantastic as well. But the next point from conversation onwards, I don't think we're there yet at all.
Can I just jump in on this, if that's okay, Katie? So, yeah, I completely agree with Rachel's sentiment. I mean, that's been our experience going into the industry over the last couple of years is, and like quite candidly from the athletes themselves, has been that they don't often feel safe to maybe share those concerns or the challenges that they're facing within the organizations, essentially because they kind of feel that that's an employer-employee relationship. So if I share it with said person, maybe that gets back to the gaffer or to the coach or to the whomever, and maybe that'll affect the selection on the weekend or my contract renewal or my status within the organization. Not only that, they feel, as Rachel referenced, that it's a tick box exercise. So yeah, they're paying lip service to our mental well-being, but it's not really it's not going far enough or doing enough. So one of the things we're rolling out right now, and we're about to roll out with the FAW and some other organizations in this very thing, is we've got one of the first, well, it is the first in the UK NHS approved wellness apps that is preventative and early detection. So it gets in early in terms of detecting any challenges that any athlete or stakeholder might face. It signposts them in the right way. But what it also does is give them access immediately, autonomously, fully, sort of data secure and private away from their organization to a mental health professional within 30 to 60 seconds. So, if anyone of the athletes who've, spoken today had a challenge or had a thought that, they were concerned, they could raise that with a mental health professional and have an instant, anonymous, autonomous response, which I think is some way towards providing that solution that Rachel talks about.
Last question, it's for you, Ollie, just before we pop into the lounge for 10 minutes. Karina says, can you tell us about the highlights and achievements you've accomplished post-rugby career?
God, well, well, my proudest one is being a dad, right? That's just unbelievable. I mean, there'd be other days where I probably wouldn't say that to you, but because they drive me crackers or whatever else. But it's just the most amazing thing looking at these two amazing human beings running around with so much personality in life, and actually sort of sense checking yourself that you're actually capable of actually producing something like that. You know, I reckon it's 99% my wife and 1% me, because they're far too intelligent and pretty to be anything associated with me. So that would probably be the one. And then, yeah, if you know, achievements or whatever, you know, medals kind of thing. I call them experiences, because the reason why I love them is that they're experiences with other people. That's why they're so special. It's not necessarily about the reward or recognition at the end of it, but you know, since playing, I've sailed around the world. I've set 4 Guinness World Records now. So been to the North Pole, been up Mount Everest, played the highest games of rugby in history up Mount Everest and at the North Pole. We've cycled across America, driven a rickshaw across the whole of India. I'm head coach for Wales women at rugby. So there's a few bits kicking around, but the only reason why it's why it's special is the people, right? It's the people that you do it with. It's the memories you create. And I always sort of said to myself, I'm here for a good time, not for a long time. So let's go out and really sort of try and enjoy life. And if in the process, create a load of memories with amazing people. And all that stuff's been done for charity. So we've raised just over £2.5 million now for the Wooden Spoon and Cancer Research UK. Mainly by just creating experiences for people that are amazing. And then I feel very sort of lucky and privileged that I've been able to do that post my career. And to be honest with you, the first couple were probably driven by this vanity project, if you like, this need for recognition and adoration. So whilst they were amazing and they were unbelievable and they were special for so many different reasons, they probably weren't for all the right reasons for me personally. And then since I've gone through that transition now, it's just made the other things that we've done just so much more special, because I've done them for the right reasons, and with the right people, and it's been an amazing experience, and I'm grateful for that.
So that's all from me in terms of bombarding our two remaining panelists with questions. I'll hand back to James now, but I just want to say thank you to Ollie and Rachel, and obviously Helen, who's gone now, for their honesty and their giving up their time to contribute to this. And thank you to James for asking me to be involved. So I will hand the control back to you now.
Please don't. No, I just want to say a massive, massive thank you, first of all, to Katie for being an incredible host and not only giving her time, but her sort of perfectly curated journalistic skill set there. I couldn't have even dreamed of doing it anywhere near that standard. Also to the speakers today, I know Helen's gone, but I really must say thank you both who are still left, obviously, and for Helen, for being so candid and so vulnerable to us all, because I think it's that is going to allow us to affect the change that's required to help others. I mean, for the future Ollies and Rachels and Helens, and those that are still, that are in the industry right now, your candidness and your openness is allowing us, and an organization like Beyond the White Line, selfishly, it's allowing myself and Beyond the White Line to ensure that generations to come benefit from your experiences and the challenges you faced and the learnings that you've taken from it. So I can't actually thank you enough. And I know that sentiment is echoed by the Carbon 6 team and Cardiff Met University. This has been a great project for them, and I'm super proud of them all for what they've achieved. So for all of you that are watching, we're going to jump into the lounge now. It's actually a really good opportunity for you to meet the speakers one-to-one, talk to them face-to-face, get off your, off mute, get on your cameras, come and say hello to them, ask them some questions. They'll be there for about 10 minutes. So feel free to jump into the tables and speak to them. And one last ask from me. I mean, obviously you're going to support the charities and go and check them out. Can you just show our speakers and hosts loads of love by hitting the emojis like absolute crazy? Lots and lots of love on the emojis, because I think it's a really cool feature. So show them some love, and we will see you all in the lounge in approximately 10 seconds.